In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, where rows of neatly trimmed lawns and colorful flower beds lined the streets, lived Sarah Thompson. She was the kind of person who always had a spark of creativity in her eyes. Her neighbors often described her as warm, friendly, and someone who brought life to the community. Sarah wasn't just a mom. She was the heart of her home, raising two lively boys, Jake, aged 8, and Ethan, aged 6, who were full of energy and imagination. Every evening, after finishing their homework and chores, Jake and Ethan would rush outside to play. They loved climbing trees, chasing each other around the yard, and dreaming up adventures that only kids could conjure. One day, while sitting under the big oak tree in their backyard, Jake turned to his mom with wide, hopeful eyes. "Mom, can we build a treehouse?" he asked excitedly. Ethan nodded eagerly beside him, chiming in, "Yeah, a real one, like in the movies." Sarah's heart melted at the sight of her boy's enthusiasm. She remembered her own childhood, when she used to dream of having a secret hideout, a place all her own where she could escape into imaginary worlds. The idea of giving her sons that same joy filled her with determination. "Of course," she said with a smile. "Let's make your dream come true." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Sarah sketched out designs for the treehouse, envisioning something magical yet practical. It wouldn't be too fancy, just a cozy wooden structure nestled among the branches of the towering oak tree. She imagined shelves for books, a small table for drawing, and even a little flag on top to give it character. With her husband David working long hours as a clerk for the Supreme Court, Sarah took charge of the project. She enlisted help from friends and neighbors, borrowing tools and gathering materials. On weekends, the backyard buzzed with activity. Neighbors stopped by to watch the progress, some even pitching in to hammer nails or paint planks. The kids were thrilled, running around and offering suggestions like, "Can we add a rope ladder?" Or, "What if there's a trapdoor?" Sarah laughed at their ideas, incorporating as many as she could. The treehouse began to take shape, becoming more than just a structure. It was a symbol of love, creativity, and family bonding. As the final touches were added, Sarah stood back to admire her work. The treehouse looked perfect, blending seamlessly with the natural beauty of the oak tree. She couldn't wait for Jake and Ethan to see it. But little did she know, this labor of love would soon become the center of controversy. While Sarah saw it as a harmless addition to their home, others in the neighborhood had very different opinions, and they weren't shy about voicing them. The treehouse was finally complete, and Sarah couldn't have been prouder. It stood tall in the oak tree like a little wooden castle, its freshly painted walls gleaming in the sunlight. Jake and Ethan wasted no time claiming it as their own, hauling up books, toys, and even a small lantern to make it feel cozy. The boys spent hours each day playing inside, giggling and shouting with delight. For Sarah, watching her son's joy made all the hard work worthwhile. But not everyone shared her excitement. Just 2 days after the treehouse was finished, Sarah noticed a white envelope tucked into the mailbox at the end of her driveway. Curious, she opened it and pulled out a letter. At first glance, it seemed official, with the neighborhood's homeowners association, HOA, logo printed at the top. As she read through the neatly typed paragraphs, her stomach sank. The HOA wasn't pleased with the treehouse at all. According to the letter, the structure violated several rules outlined in the community's bylaws. First, it exceeded the maximum allowable height for backyard features. Second, it didn't conform to the visual harmony of the neighborhood, a vague phrase Sarah had never heard before. And third, it hadn't received prior approval from the HOA board, which was apparently mandatory for any new construction on private property. The letter ended with a stern warning: remove the treehouse within 1 week, or face legal consequences. Sarah stared at the paper in disbelief. How could something so innocent cause such trouble? She glanced back at the treehouse, where Jake and Ethan were laughing and pretending to be pirates. To them, it wasn't just a bunch of wood and nails. It was their fortress, their clubhouse, their escape from the world. How could anyone think it was a problem? Determined to understand what had gone wrong, Sarah flipped through the thick HOA handbook she'd been given when they moved in. Sure enough, buried deep in the fine print were the rules about backyard structures. The height limit was 10 feet, but Sarah had measured the treehouse carefully. It was only 8 feet tall. As for visual harmony, the term was so broad that it could mean almost anything. Frustrated, Sarah realized this wasn't really about the treehouse itself. It was about control. The HOA wanted to maintain strict order, no matter how unreasonable it seemed. Over the next few days, whispers spread throughout the neighborhood. Some neighbors stopped by to offer support, telling Sarah how much they admired the treehouse and thought the HOA was being too harsh. Others avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. One afternoon, an older woman named Mrs. Peterson knocked on Sarah's door. She served on the HOA board and tried to explain their position. "It's not personal," she said stiffly. "We have standards to uphold." Sarah bit her tongue, resisting the urge to argue. Instead, she politely asked if there was any way to resolve the issue without tearing down the treehouse. Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "Rules are rules," she replied before walking away. As the deadline loomed closer, Sarah felt a mix of anger and helplessness. She had poured her heart into the project, and now it felt like the HOA was punishing her for simply being a good mom. What kind of community would try to take away a child's happiness over something so small? Late one night, as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the dreaded letter, David walked in. He saw the stress on her face and immediately knew something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked softly, pulling up a chair beside her. Sarah handed him the letter, explaining everything that had happened. David listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back and gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said calmly. "This isn't over yet." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't going to let the HOA take away something that meant so much to her family without a fight. The treehouse wasn't just wood and nails. It was a symbol of creativity, love, and joy for her boys. If the HOA wanted a battle, she'd give them one. But she'd do it the right way. That meant attending their next meeting and presenting her case calmly and clearly. The HOA meetings were held in the community center's small conference room, a space usually reserved for holiday potlucks or gardening workshops. But today, the atmosphere felt tense. As Sarah walked in, she noticed several familiar faces. Mrs. Peterson from the board, a few other neighbors who served on the committee, and some curious residents who had shown up to see what all the fuss was about. She took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was there. For Jake and Ethan. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah stood up and placed a folder on the table in front of her. Inside were blueprints of the treehouse, photos showing its modest design, and even handwritten notes from Jake and Ethan explaining how much they loved it. "I understand the importance of maintaining our neighborhood's beauty," she began, her voice steady but warm. "But I also believe we can find a balance between rules and compassion." She went on to explain that the treehouse didn't exceed the height limit, pointing out measurements she had double-checked herself. She showed pictures of similar backyard structures in neighboring communities, arguing that these weren't eyesores. They added character and charm. Then, she pulled out the letters from her sons. "This isn't just a project for me," she said, holding up the colorful pages filled with childish handwriting and doodles. "It's a place where my kids can dream, play, and feel safe. Isn't that what every parent wants for their children?" For a moment, the room was silent. Some board members exchanged glances, while others scribbled notes. A man sitting near the back nodded slightly, as if impressed by her preparation. But Mrs. Peterson quickly broke the silence. "Mrs. Thompson," she said sharply, "while your intentions are admirable, you've failed to seek approval before starting construction. Rules exist for a reason, to ensure fairness and consistency across the neighborhood. Sarah clenched her fists under the table but kept her composure. "I understand the need for rules," she replied, "but when did enforcing them become more important than fostering kindness and understanding? Would you really punish a family over a treehouse that brings so much happiness?" Her word hung in the air, but the board remained unmoved. After a brief discussion, they reiterated their stance. The treehouse had to go. They called her entitled for challenging their authority and accused her of trying to bend the rules to suit her needs. The dismissal stung, but Sarah refused to let it break her spirit. As the meeting adjourned, she gathered her papers and left the room, her head held high. That evening, Sarah recounted the events to David, who listened intently. By now, he knew the HOA wasn't going to back down easily. "They're not used to people standing up to them," he said thoughtfully. "But maybe it's time someone did." He leaned forward, his tone firm yet encouraging. "Let me help you with this. Trust me, we've got options." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the resolve in his voice. Until now, David had always been the quiet, behind-the-scenes type, content to let her handle things at home. But seeing him step up gave her strength. For the first time since the HOA drama began, she felt like they might actually have a chance, not just to save the treehouse, but to prove a point about fairness and common sense. As they sat together in the living room, brainstorming their next steps, Sarah glanced out the window at the oak tree. The treehouse stood tall against the fading light, its wooden walls glowing softly in the dusk. It wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, unity, and hope. And no HOA letter was going to change that. That night, after the kids were tucked into bed, Sarah and David sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of them. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Sarah looked at her husband, who seemed unusually focused as he flipped through legal documents and highlighted sections with a yellow marker. She had always known David was smart. He worked as a clerk for the U.S. Supreme Court, after all. But she hadn't realized how much his job had taught him about navigating tricky situations like this. "Okay," David said, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Here's what we're dealing with. The HOA thinks they have all the power because they've scared people into following their rules for years. But here's the thing. They don't actually have as much authority as they claim." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" David leaned back in his chair and explained. While HOAs could enforce certain guidelines, those rules couldn't override local zoning laws or violate homeowners' rights. He pulled out a copy of the neighborhood's bylaws and pointed to a section that mentioned compliance with city ordinances. "See this? It means if the treehouse meets the city's standards, which it does, then the HOA can't force us to tear it down. They're bluffing." Sarah's eyes widened. "So, we might actually win this." David nodded. "We just need to show them, and anyone else who challenges us, that we know our rights. And trust me, I've seen plenty of cases where HOAs overstep their boundaries. Judges usually side with homeowners when the rules are unfair or overly restrictive." With renewed energy, the couple spent hours drafting a response to the HOA's letter. David used his expertise to craft a detailed rebuttal, citing specific court rulings and legal precedents that supported their position. Sarah added personal touches, including heartfelt explanations about why the treehouse mattered so much to her family. Together, they created a document that was both professional and deeply human, a perfect blend of logic and emotion. The next morning, Sarah hand-delivered the response to the HOA board members. She made sure to give each one a copy, along with a polite note inviting them to reconsider their stance. Then she waited. Days passed without any word from the board, but Sarah noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now smiled and waved, some even stopping by to express support. One woman named Lisa, who lived 2 doors down, admitted she'd always wanted to build a garden shed, but was too afraid of the HOA's reaction. If anyone can stand up to them, it's you, she told Sarah with a wink. But not everyone was pleased. Mrs. Peterson, the head of the HOA board, called Sarah later that week. Her tone was icy. "You seem to think you're above the rules, Mrs. Thompson," she said. "Challenging the board won't change anything." Sarah took a deep breath, remembering David's advice to stay calm. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she replied. "I'm simply asking for fairness. If the treehouse violates actual laws, then fine, we'll address that. But if it doesn't, I hope you'll agree that tearing it down would be unnecessary." Mrs. Peterson huffed before hanging up, but Sarah felt confident they had planted a seed of doubt. Meanwhile, David continued researching, uncovering more information about similar disputes in other neighborhoods. In almost every case, the homeowners had prevailed, often exposing the HOA's tactics as heavy-handed and unreasonable. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to feel a shift, not just in the neighborhood dynamics, but within herself. Before this ordeal, she might have backed down, worried about rocking the boat or making enemies. But now she realized the importance of standing up for what was right, even if it meant facing resistance. With David by her side, she felt unstoppable. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Jake and Ethan play in the fading light, Sarah turned to David with a smile. "You know," she said, "this whole thing has been exhausting, but it's also kind of exciting. For once, we're not letting someone else call the shots." David chuckled. "Exactly. Sometimes, you have to remind people that rules are supposed to serve the community, not control it." Little did they know, the real storm was yet to come. But for now, they enjoyed the quiet victory of knowing they were fighting the good fight, and doing it together. The HOA's response came sooner than Sarah expected, and it was far more aggressive than she had anticipated. Instead of backing down, they doubled down. A certified letter arrived in the mail one Tuesday morning, its contents sealed in an official envelope. Sarah opened it with trembling hands, her heart sinking as she read the words. The HOA was filing a lawsuit against her. They claimed the treehouse diminished property values and set a dangerous precedent for other homeowners who might try to flout the rules. The stakes were higher now, and Sarah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Word of the lawsuit spread quickly through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some neighbors rallied behind Sarah, offering words of encouragement or dropping off homemade cookies as a gesture of support. Others whispered behind closed doors, criticizing her for causing trouble and worrying that the drama would bring down home prices. Divisions grew, turning what had once been a peaceful community into a tense battleground of opinions. Even Lisa, who had initially supported Sarah, seemed hesitant to speak up too loudly, afraid of drawing the HOA's ire. For Sarah, the emotional toll was immense. Every time the phone rang or the doorbell chimed, she braced herself for another confrontation. She found herself lying awake at night, wondering if she had made a mistake by standing her ground. What if they lost? Would they have to pay expensive legal fees? Could this affect David's career? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but David remained a steady anchor. He reminded her daily that they were on solid footing legally and morally. "We're not backing down," he said firmly. "If anything, this lawsuit proves how unreasonable they are." When the court date finally arrived, Sarah dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional yet approachable. A navy blue dress paired with simple flats. David accompanied her, his calm demeanor masking the strategic brilliance simmering beneath the surface. As they walked into the courtroom, Sarah felt a mix of nerves and determination. This wasn't just about a treehouse anymore. It was about fairness, justice, and setting an example for others who might face similar battles. The trial began with the HOA presenting their case. Their lawyer argued passionately, painting the treehouse as a blight on the neighborhood's pristine image. He cited vague studies about how non-conforming structures could lower property values, though he struggled to provide concrete evidence specific to their community. Mrs. Peterson took the stand, her tone clipped and authoritative, as she recounted the HOA's efforts to enforce order. But under cross-examination by David, cracks began to show in her testimony. When asked why certain wealthier residents had been allowed to build elaborate gazebos or install bright floodlights without consequence, she stumbled over her words, exposing inconsistencies in the HOA's enforcement. Then it was Sarah and David's turn. David stepped up confidently, speaking in clear, measured tones as he dismantled the HOA's arguments piece by piece. He presented documents showing that the Treehouse complied with local zoning laws, which took precedence over HOA bylaws. He highlighted cases where courts had ruled against HOAs for overstepping their authority, emphasizing that these organizations existed to serve residents, not dictate their lives. Finally, he introduced heartfelt letters from Jake and Ethan, reading excerpts aloud to remind everyone what was truly at stake: a child's happiness and a family's right to create memories in their own home. Sarah followed with her testimony, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She spoke candidly about why she built the Treehouse, sharing stories of her son's laughter and the joy it brought to their lives. She addressed the accusations head-on, pointing out that the Treehouse didn't block views, make noise, or harm anyone. It simply existed as a symbol of love and creativity. By the time she finished, even the judge seemed moved, nodding thoughtfully as he jotted notes. As the trial progressed, it became clear that public opinion was shifting. Reporters covering the case wrote articles highlighting the absurdity of suing someone over a treehouse, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #SaveTheTreehouse and #FairnessOverFear. Neighbors who had stayed silent before began speaking out, admitting that the HOA's actions felt excessive and unfair. By the end of the day, Sarah and David left the courtroom hand in hand, exhausted but hopeful. They knew the fight wasn't over yet, but they also knew they had struck a powerful blow against the HOA's bullying tactics. For the first time since the ordeal began, Sarah allowed herself to believe that justice might prevail, and that their little treehouse could inspire something much bigger than she'd ever imagined. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. Sarah and David sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly together. They had poured their hearts into this case, presenting evidence, challenging the HOA's arguments, and standing firm in their belief that fairness should triumph over rigid rules. Now, all they could do was wait. The judge cleared his throat, glancing down at his notes before addressing the room. After careful consideration of the facts presented, he began, his voice steady and authoritative. This court finds in favor of the defendants, Sarah and David Thompson. A wave of relief washed over Sarah, so powerful it nearly brought her to tears. The judge went on to explain that while HOAs had the right to enforce reasonable guidelines, those rules couldn't override local zoning laws or infringe upon homeowners' rights without valid justification. In this case, the Treehouse complied with city ordinances and posed no harm to the neighborhood. Furthermore, the HOA's selective enforcement of its own bylaws undermined its credibility. As the gavel struck the bench, signaling the end of the trial, Sarah turned to David, her eyes shining with gratitude and pride. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. David nodded, a rare smile spreading across his face. For once, he allowed himself to bask in the victory, not just for their family, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against an overbearing HOA. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, eager to capture the moment. Cameras flashed as Sarah spoke candidly about the journey, thanking her neighbors for their support and urging others facing similar challenges not to give up. "This wasn't just about a treehouse," she said, her voice strong and clear. "It was about standing up for what's right and reminding people that communities are built on kindness and understanding, not fear and control." News of the ruling spread quickly, sparking conversations far beyond their quiet suburban neighborhood. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath tale of resilience and justice. Social media lit up with messages of celebration, many praising Sarah and David for taking a stand. Even strangers reached out, sharing stories of their own battles with HOAs and expressing hope that this case would inspire change. Back in the neighborhood, the reaction was mixed but telling. Some residents cheered openly, leaving notes of congratulations on Sarah's doorstep or stopping by to shake her hand. Others remained silent, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in power dynamics. But the most surprising response came from within the HOA itself. Within days of the verdict, several board members, including Mrs. Peterson, resigned, citing personal reasons. Rumors circulated that they were overwhelmed by public backlash and internal divisions. A new group of volunteers stepped forward to lead the organization, promising a more balanced and compassionate approach moving forward. For Sarah, the aftermath of the trial brought both closure and transformation. The Treehouse, once a source of contention, became a symbol of unity and courage. Neighbors started visiting more often, bringing their kids to play or sitting under the oak tree to chat. It wasn't unusual to see Lisa lounging on a bench nearby, finally working on the garden shed she'd always dreamed of building. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift, from one of tension and fear to one of collaboration and mutual respect. One sunny afternoon, Sarah hosted a small gathering in her backyard to celebrate the victory. She invited neighbors, friends, and even some former critics of the Treehouse. As laughter filled the air and plates of homemade snacks were passed around, Sarah looked out at the scene with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in months. Her boys were climbing the rope ladder, shouting excitedly as they pretended to be explorers discovering new lands. Nearby, David stood talking with a few neighbors, his usual reserved demeanor softened by the warmth of shared triumph. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the yard, Sarah took a quiet moment to reflect. What had started as a simple act of love for her children had turned into something much bigger, a lesson in perseverance, justice, and the power of community. And though the road had been long and difficult, she knew it had been worth every step. The treehouse still stood tall in the oak tree, its wooden walls weathered slightly by time but stronger than ever, a testament to the idea that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can lead to the greatest victories. In the weeks following the trial, life in the neighborhood began to settle into a new rhythm. The treehouse, once at the center of controversy, became a cherished landmark, a symbol of resilience and unity. Sarah noticed subtle changes all around her. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves now waved warmly as they passed by on morning walks. Others stopped to chat over fences, sharing stories or asking for advice about backyard projects they'd been too afraid to attempt before. The HOA's grip on the community loosened, replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. The new HOA leadership made good on their promise to be more reasonable. Gone were the days of nitpicking minor infractions. Instead, they focused on fostering a sense of belonging among residents. They organized events like block parties and gardening workshops, encouraging everyone to come together and celebrate what made their neighborhood special. When Lisa finally built her long-awaited garden shed, no one batted an eye. In fact, several neighbors pitched in to help paint it. It was as if the entire community had taken a collective breath and realized that rules existed to enhance lives, not restrict them. For Jake and Ethan, the treehouse remained their favorite spot. They filled it with treasures collected from their adventures, shiny rocks, colorful feathers, and even a jar labeled pirate gold, which actually held marbles. On weekends, friends from the neighborhood joined them, turning the treehouse into a bustling hub of activity. Sometimes, parents would sit beneath the oak tree, sipping coffee and chatting while their kids laughed above. What had once been seen as a threat to property values was now celebrated as a place where imaginations ran wild and friendships blossomed. Sarah found herself reflecting often on how much had changed, not just in the neighborhood but within her own family. The ordeal had brought her and David closer than ever. Through late-night strategy sessions and quiet moments of encouragement, they had rediscovered the strength of their partnership. David, typically reserved, had revealed a side of himself Sarah hadn't fully appreciated before, his unwavering determination to fight for what was right. And Sarah, in turn, had discovered reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. Together, they had faced a seemingly insurmountable challenge and emerged stronger for it. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah decided to host a small event in the backyard to mark the end of an era. She called it a Treehouse celebration, inviting neighbors to gather under the golden leaves of the oak tree. Tables were set up with homemade pies, cider, and cookies shaped like trees and stars. Kids darted around playing tag, while adults lounged in chairs, reminiscing about the summer's drama and marveling at how far things had come. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, Sarah stood up to say a few words. Holding a mug of steaming cider, she smiled at the faces gathered around her. "This treehouse started as a dream for my boys," she began, her voice steady and heartfelt. "But it turned into something bigger, a reminder that standing up for what you believe in can bring people together. None of us could have predicted how this little structure would change our community, but I'm so grateful it did." Her words earned applause, followed by cheers from the crowd. Someone suggested making the treehouse an annual tradition, a spot for storytelling nights or charity fundraisers. Others chimed in enthusiastically, already brainstorming ideas. By the time the party wound down and guests headed home, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was better, kinder, more connected. Later that evening, as Sarah tucked Jake and Ethan into bed, they begged her to read one last story. She chose their favorite, a tale of bravery and adventure, and kissed them goodnight. Walking back downstairs, she paused by the window to look out at the treehouse bathed in moonlight. Its wooden walls seemed almost magical in the soft glow, a silent witness to everything they had overcome. As she turned off the lights and joined David on the couch, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, yes, but it had taught her invaluable lessons about resilience, justice, and the power of community. And though she knew life would always have its challenges, she also knew that as long as they stood together, as a family and as neighbors, they could face anything.